He currently resides in Barnet. For 8 years, Mr. Farlise Rubio was regularly seen in his monthly Starstruck segments on Channel 3's WCAX TV's 6:30 p.m. news show, on which he presented the latest happenings in the field of astronomy. During his 18-year tenure at St. Johnsbury's Fairbanks Museum, Bobby was the teacher for the Guinness World Record largest astronomy lesson. Raised in Hialeah, Florida, from Cuban and African American roots, Bobby is also an avid musician who plays in the local band Tritium Well, am I saying that correctly? As well as his solo music endeavor, Bobby and the Isotopes. Please welcome Bobby Farlise Rubio.
Thank you, everyone. Pardon my garb, I just returned from a long, cold journey through the Carpathian Mountains and in the Arctic to retrieve some lost artificial intelligence property that you may have heard of. All right, well, welcome and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Marita, for making this possible, for getting me here. I think I'm safe to take off my gloves. You don't look infected, you folks. So yes, I'm going to start with a story that is a true story. It took place in the year 1732, even before the United States was a country, when Vermont was Abenaki land sandwiched between New France and New England. And during that time, way on the other side of the world, in a place everyone has heard of when they think about Halloween, Transylvania. So this actually happened in 1732 in a small village called Medvezda. You may have heard the music that was playing a moment ago. That is authentic Romany music, the music of the Haiduks, which is what they call the people that we have historically known as the gypsies in this country. And that music is part of what might have been heard in this village in 1732. You see, Medvezda suffered a tragedy. Unexpectedly, 20 people in this small town all died in a short period of time. And they did not know how to solve this. They didn't have any doctors or clinics, so they sent a letter to the capital of their empire, which was the Habsburg Empire, if you know your history, or the Holy Roman Empire. And the capital was hundreds of miles away in Frankfurt. And they sent the letter saying, please send the doctor. We have many dead and sick, and we need help. And I don't know why they picked this doctor, but his name was Johannes Flukinger. Maybe he lost a bet. Maybe he drew the short straw. But poor Dr. Flukinger was sent on his horse over the hills into the mountains on the far eastern edge of the empire. And when he got to Medvezda, well, it was late. It had been many months. And he arrived in the village and asked, hello, I am the doctor that you sent for. I'm here to treat the sick. And they're like, sick? You mean dead? They all died already. And he's like, where are they? Well, where do you think? In the cemetery. So he walked with the villagers to the cemetery, and one by one they disinterred 20 coffins. And one by one they opened 20 coffins. And most of them, 13 of them, had contents that Dr. Flukinger expected to see. Disgusting, rotting corpses. No surprise, he was a doctor. He was used to seeing things like this. And he said, okay, those are dead for sure. But then 7 of the coffins contained something quite unexpected. In 7 of the coffins, there were bodies that did not look like they were dead. They looked like they were just simply sleeping. They had rosy cheeks, no signs of decomposition, not even an odor. And when he lifted up their hands, their fingers were still soft and maybe bent. No rigor mortis had set in. But perhaps more disturbing than that was the fact that these 7 corpses had bloodstains in the corners of their mouths. And One of them was actually floating face down in the coffin filled with blood, like a big blood jacuzzi or something. And Dr. Flukinger did not know how to explain what he just saw. And he asked the villagers, what's going on with these 7? And they're like, welcome to Transylvania. Because these 7 are what our grandparents always told us about. We've heard these stories for centuries, that these are vampires. But Dr. Flukinger was a man of science. He didn't believe in vampires. He thought that that was just superstitious stuff that the country folk believed. But he was a scientist, so he had to ask questions. And he said, where did this plague begin? Who was the first of these to succumb to the strangeness? And they said, oh, that guy. And they pointed to the coffin that was halfway filled with blood, with the guy floating face down. They're like, he's the one who started it. That's Arnold Paul, they told him. Arnold had been a soldier with the Empire on the border with the Ottoman Empire, our centuries-long enemy. And he had been placed on the frontier to patrol, but he said while he was on his post that he was attacked by a vampire. And it scared him so terribly that he ran straight home. Now, of course, a soldier that deserts his post could face execution or imprisonment, so it must have been really scary for him to take that chance and run away. And when he came back, the village welcomed him in, but his fiancée said, he's not the same man I remember. He's changed. He's different. Arnold used to be the kind of guy who would get up every morning at sunrise. Now he sleeps all day. And he doesn't get up until it's after dark. And the other villagers started to worry because they had heard of things like this before. They had heard of people changing suddenly and becoming weird. So they started what you could call a Transylvanian edition of Neighborhood Watch. And the villagers at night would walk through the streets with lanterns and maybe a sword or a club, just in case. And they didn't hear anything that first night, but the next morning, they heard a scream from the middle of the village. My cow! My cow! Everyone come and look what's happened to my cow! And the villagers said, what's happened? Oh, that's the old man we buy milk from. That old man had one possession in his life, his dairy cow. And his occupation was selling milk and butter to his neighbors, and that's how he survived. And his one cow was covered in bite marks, blood and drool covering the back of this cow. All the villagers were inspecting and trying to see what could have bitten the cow so badly. And they noticed that the bite marks did not match those of the local bears or wolves, but instead it looked like the bites were made by a human-sized mouse. They all had their suspicions already. You see, one of the neighbors spoke up and said, yeah, last night I didn't see anything, but I heard somebody crawling around on all fours making growling noises. I thought it was a beast, but maybe it's Arnold Paul. And they thought he was transforming into something somewhere halfway between a human and a wild animal. You might be thinking, vampire, but no, they thought he was turning into a werewolf. Now, if you lived in Transylvania at that time, you would recognize that a werewolf was like a larval stage, like the caterpillar that can become a butterfly. A werewolf can only turn into one animal, but if it continues its development, it can become something more powerful, something that can turn into multiple kinds of animals, like a bat, or a snake, or a worm, or even rats, or fog. Could you imagine how terrifying it would be to grow up in Transylvania? Thinking every time you saw the fog in the morning, it could be a vampire in disguise. So they were worried that Arnold Paul was on his way to becoming something even worse. So they doubled the numbers of neighbors patrolling on the neighborhood watch the next night. And one farmer, while he was on his patrol, heard a rustling in the bushes. He went to investigate, and out from the bushes jumped Arnold Paul. Ah! Don't hurt me! But luckily that farmer had a club in his hand, and clunk! He hit Arnold Paul so hard on the head that he was knocked out cold dead in one blow. You think the story's over, right? Oh, but they knew this might not be the end of it all. just in case, when they buried him in the cemetery, they took Arnold Powell and they put him face down in his coffin. Why? So it would be harder for him to find his exit if he turned into a vampire. This is true, and this has been documented happening in many grave sites around Europe, including Italy, so it wasn't just Transylvanians that thought that their neighbors might come back as vampires. But after they buried Arnold Powell, days after he was dead, other people in the village started getting sick. Some children unexpectedly died. And altogether, 19 more people were buried in that cemetery, all in a short period of time. And they blamed it on Arnold Powell. They said, we must have failed in our efforts because he must be sneaking out of his grave and attacking these poor innocent villagers. Well, Dr. Flukiger listened with intent, but he couldn't understand how this would be possible. He didn't believe that a man in his grave could crawl out at night and go attack other people. But Dr. Flukiger was skeptical until one last thing happened while he was in the cemetery. You probably know what happened next, because anybody who's ever cared about any vampire story or watched even just one movie probably knows the proper way to dispatch with a vampire. They walked into the woods and they grabbed 7 little saplings, they cut, and they sharpened them to points, and they walked up to those open coffins, and one by one, they started staking their hearts. And Dr. Flukiger was trying to stop them, like, what are you doing? This is desecration. These are your friends and neighbors. Don't desecrate their bodies. But then when they staked one heart, he heard. Now Dr. Flukiger was starting to believe in vampires because he just heard a dead body scream. Well, I know this might be getting exciting. I hope no one's too terrified yet. But maybe this would be a good time to remind you, there's no such thing as werewolves or vampires. Unless you caught a mosquito and a tick, because they really do suck your blood. But vampires and werewolves like that don't exist, but this story that I just told you, partly, is one of the things that inspired all of the stories and movies that you've seen about vampires. But before I go any further, I want to see if anyone in the audience can guess. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, there are no wrong answers, just take your best guess. Can you think of anything that can explain what happened in Medvezhda without resorting to the supernatural? Anybody have an idea? No bad guesses here. Go ahead, just speak up or raise your hand. What do you think?
Excessive gas built up in the body?
Well, dead bodies do bloat, and gases can make weird sounds when they escape from small holes. That could be part of it. But we have a lot of things to explain, like the fact that these bodies had not decomposed, and the fact that one of them screamed when its heart was staked. Any other guesses? That what would give the appearance of someone reaching beyond the grave and attacking their neighbors when we can't expect that to be possible. Yes, back there.
Were they buried alive?
Well, that certainly used to happen back in those days. There's a little bit of a side note, but have you heard of the term saved by the bell? It does not refer to boxing. You can look in the history of the patent office and see that there were many hundreds of patents for little bells that could be rung by a corpse inside their coffin, just in case. So I even know a doctor who lived for almost 100 years in Wells River, Harry Rowe, and he practiced medicine for a long time, but we almost didn't have him as a doctor because he was almost buried alive when he got kicked by a horse in the head as a child. He was 7, and they had laid him out on the bed, given the last rites, expecting to have the funeral the next day, and his sister walked into the room and saw his little toes start twitching. And that's what saved him from being buried alive. And think of how many people he helped throughout his life. Maybe that's why he wanted to be a doctor. So yes, it could happen, and even 100 years ago that was still possible. But no, that wouldn't be possible in this case because they had been buried for months. And this was January when Dr. Flukiger arrived. And I don't know if you know Transylvania, which is a region in Eastern Europe that encompasses, today it's mostly in Romania, but traditionally Transylvania was a broader region that encompassed, during the Habsburg Empire, parts of Ukraine, Poland, Serbia, and Romania, before those countries had those names and those borders. But, so, it was cold. So, They couldn't have survived underground without food and air for that long. But buried alive is not a bad guess. Any other guesses? Don't be shy. Yes?
Some kind of cryonic stage.
There have been people who have been accidentally hibernated, like a cross-country skier in Norway who fell between boulders under the snow and was not found until the next spring, but because he was so cold, he was able to survive, and they brought him back. He lost a couple toes to frostbite, but that's an amazing story. But that's something that's incredibly rare. You couldn't imagine it happening to 7 people all at the same time. But yeah, weird things do happen like that. But let's just say, like the little munchkin in The Wizard of Oz, they were certifiably dead. They were truly dead. So, any other guesses? No one?
It sounds like it might have been an infectious thing if one person imparted it to another.
Can you think of any infections that might make someone act like a werewolf?
Rabies.
Who said it? That is almost certainly what was happening in Medvesta at that time. Let's start with how it began. Arnold Paul said he had been attacked by a vampire. But if you grew up in Transylvania, then you thought a vampire could take many forms. It could have been a dog. It could have been a wolf. It could have been a bat, which is even today in the modern world the most common source of rabies infections in Europe is bats. So they were right to be afraid of bats in a way. If you saw a bat acting strange in your house, that could lead to lots of tragic things. And so he probably was attacked by one of these animals, most likely a bat, and he was so terrified that he ran home, and then his fiancée said he had been changed. His behavior was different. Well, let's think about this for a moment. Rabies is a very strange virus compared to other viruses because it does not travel through your bloodstream, and luckily it does not travel through the air. Let's be glad for that. But rabies, if you get it, and you've probably heard this before, the only way to get rabies is to get bit by an animal that has it, or to eat an animal uncooked that has it. And I don't think most of you folks eat raw squirrels. So, for humans, it's going to be most likely a bite. And think about this, in all the lore, how does a werewolf make another werewolf? With a bite. How does a vampire make another vampire? With a bite. So that part of the story sounds exactly like rabies. And so if Arnold Paul was bit by an animal with rabies, a bat maybe on his finger, most likely, it would have taken that virus several days to travel along his nerves. I've never heard of another virus that does this. It travels along the nerves instead of through the bloodstream. If it traveled through the bloodstream, it would get into his brain within seconds. But by traveling along the nerves, it takes days. So for days, you show no symptoms. And you can go anywhere you want. And then it starts moving into your brain cells. And like any virus, it takes over your cells and starts turning them into virus factories, which means you're losing cells. You literally start to lose your mind. But rabies doesn't just strike any parts of the mind. It seems to have a preference for certain areas. And the first area that gets infected with rabies in your brain is the part that regulates your sense of taste. This is one of the reasons why they used to call rabies hydrophobia, because water starts tasting like acid. So if you give a person with rabies a cup of water, they'll spit it out and they'll think you just tried to poison them or give them something bitter and horrible. So now you're going to start getting dehydrated, which is going to add to your downward spiral in your health. And the bright lights seem to bother people with rabies. So that's why you might explain the nocturnal behavior, staying away from the sun, like vampires do, right? And then it starts affecting other parts of your brain, including the part that helps you recognize the faces of your loved ones. This is one of the most tragic things about rabies, because the people that you live in your household will look like strangers to you. And they'll come up and give you a glass of water. Honey, you don't look so well. And you're like, get away from me, you stranger, you're giving me poison. And so people start to get irrational and maybe even violent. And if you think about the rabies point of view, which, you know, a virus is such a simple thing. Some scientists don't even know whether to call them life or not. But rabies wants to spread. And so if it turns you into an irrational and violent creature that is likely to kick and punch and bite people around you, then you're just going to become more likely to spread the disease, which is how rabies is still alive today. So a lot of the things that happen in the story could be explained by rabies and the symptoms of having the virus. But let's remember that Arnold Paul was beaten to death. He died violently. Not everybody who gets rabies dies that way. Sometimes, if you are lucky, you'll just go unconscious and nobody will know why. And they'll put you in your bed and weep over you, but you'll die peacefully. So that's probably the best way to go with rabies. But let's imagine you don't go that way and you don't get clonked on the head by an angry neighbor. What happens is that you're losing brain cells constantly. And eventually, all that blood that your body has been pumping into your brain to keep your brain alive has got nowhere to go because there's no cells to receive it. So it starts to leak. And guess where it's going to leak out of first? The biggest hole in your head, yes, your mouth. So a person who has died of rabies will often be found with the mouth filled with blood. And this happened a lot in the old days because sometimes someone would still be half conscious, half thinking, and they would realize, oh no, I saw what happened to my neighbor when they went this way. I don't want to hurt my friends and neighbors. I don't want to do that to them. So I'm going to just flee the village. And people would self-exile. They would just run for the hills, never be seen again for months until one day maybe a hunter or a traveler would find their corpse. And if they picked them up and flipped them over, they would find this mouthful of blood. And then they would assume, oh, you had become a vampire. It's kind of tragic, but if you think about it, it's pretty incredible. We might think these are superstitions of simple folk, but this is actually a pretty complex thing. Figuring out how the virus gets into the body, what happens while you're alive if you have it, and what happens to you after you die are all connected by the folklore of the vampire and the werewolf in Transylvania. Yes?
I'm sorry, I missed, how does it, if a person has rabies, how do they give it to somebody else?
If they bite them or kick them, if they draw blood and somehow their blood or saliva mix in. So like if you were a person with rabies and somebody's trying to help you and you were mad and you thought they were hurting you, you might scratch at them and that might be enough. If you get a cut on your hand and you scratch them, draw blood, then that could be enough. Or bite them or even just spit at them and they have an open wound. That alone. Oh, and remember that dehydration part, this is what leads to one of the most famous symptoms of rabies, which is the foaming at the mouth. If you're not drinking water, your saliva starts to be more like a glue instead of like a liquid. And if you bite somebody with with regular saliva, it might wash the wound clean. But with rabies type saliva, that saliva is going to stick to the wound, giving the virus more time to find its way into the next person's body. So that whole thing, they bite you on the neck and they make you one of them. Well, if a person with rabies bit you on the neck, yeah, you certainly would catch it that way. So it's interesting that they caught that part in the folklore, and that's basically medically accurate. So I often think of the vampire werewolf legend as sort of a public service announcement, sort of an early attempt of the public health department to keep people safe. Yes?
Is there a certain time of the year where rabies is dormant and nobody has it?
That's a good question. The thing about rabies is that any animal that gets it is going to die within a few days. So it's more common in the summer, and this is a bit of a side note, our state actually spends quite a bit of time and money flying helicopters and airplanes, dropping hundreds of millions of packets of bait with rabies vaccine in them. So this is why we have relatively low infection rates. The squirrels, the skunks, the raccoons, the animals most likely to get it, often are vaccinated just by our efforts to prevent them from but I know a young lady who's growing up in Lindenville who, when she was young, very small, like 10, she saw a raccoon wander into her yard. And, being a kid, you would think, oh, lucky me, I see a raccoon. And the raccoon was overly friendly until suddenly it was attacking her. And she got rabies, but luckily in today's world, she was taken to the hospital and she got her shots. And she's now an adult and totally healthy, no problem. But in 1732, there was no such thing. And so there was nothing you could do for someone. But as far as the time of year, I think summer is just easier to spread. And a couple other things, only mammals that are placental mammals can carry rabies. Fortunately for us, the opossums, which are now common here, they're marsupials, and their body temperature is slightly lower than placental mammals, so they can't get rabies. So they might bite you, but they won't have rabies. So, but other mammals, any other mammal that has a placenta and basically has our body temperature, that's the right environment for rabies. So, we still have a couple mysteries to answer about this. Maybe rabies explains how Arnold Powell was acting weird and being violent with his neighbors, but he died. So how come other people got sick long after he was buried? You might remember some of the details. We're all detectives here now. Think of what happened in the village that might explain how it spread. Say that? Who said that? Yes, the milk. You see, the cow didn't die, at least not right away. So that neighbor was relieved that his cow was still alive, but he continued to sell milk to his neighbors. And so those children and the other folks that had maybe never even saw Arnold Powell, they got sick from infected milk. And eventually that cow would have died about a week later or less, but by then it would have been too late. So the other 19 people were basically drinking infected milk. So that might explain how it was spread. But what about the screaming? What about that? How do we explain that part? But wouldn't they have rotted and decomposed like the others? I mean, the gas is escaping, the air escaping is certainly valid, but why would the vocal cords still work if they had been decomposing for months? Well, that's the creepy part about rabies, and actually the people who might be best to guess at what would cause that are the folks who have experience with hunting. Because right now is hunting season, and you may see which one of your neighbors has succeeded in getting a buck, because it might look like they're showing off. You know what I'm talking about? They hang the deer outside their home in a tree, right? And there's a very good reason for that. Does anybody want to tell it before I do? Anybody know why it's not showing off?
Well, they bleed it.
They drain the blood out. And why would they do that? What's the whole point of hunting, right? Is to get venison for your freezer so you have something delicious to eat in the fall and winter and spring, right? Well, what a shame it would be if you went through all that trouble spending hours stalking deer in the woods and all of a sudden all your meat rotted. So, if you want to keep the meat fresh, you need to get the blood out. And this is actually what butchers and hunters do, but this is what rabies does. You see where I'm going with this? You see, blood is where the decomposition begins. But rabies has a strange way of draining the blood out of its victims. And remember Arnold Powell was buried face down, and his coffin was halfway filled with blood? That was his own blood. And the other victims probably weren't buried face down because they weren't suspected of being vampires, but they probably were buried after they had already been exsanguinated. They bled all over their beds or wherever they were left when they died. And so if you take a dead body and you drain all the blood out, and then you quickly bury it in the cold clay Carpathian soils of Transylvania, it's like putting it in the refrigerator. And so, not in every climate, but in that climate, you might accidentally make an exquisitely preserved corpse. And then when Dr. Flukiger went to inspect them, because they had so little blood in their bodies, they hadn't rotted. Rigor mortis, which is caused by the rotting of the blood, did not happen. So their bodies looked as the same state that they were at the moment when they died. So they looked like they could just wake back up. And that is another part of the vampire lore. They're the undead, right? So I just think it's so fascinating. We have this legend, but it's actually based on people observing real things and not having microscopes to explain the virus and not having the medical knowledge we have today. They made up a legend that was actually useful for keeping you safe. And then we get to this. Anybody recognize this guy? I could stop for a moment if anybody has any questions about what I just told you, but that story was printed many times around the world in newspapers. It was one of those historical tales of the strange. And there was a paper in Dublin, Ireland, that had published it in the late 1800s, and it was read by a local playwright named Abraham, Bram for short, Bram Stoker. He owned a playhouse in Dublin, And he knew that horror stories were the ones that most likely to sell out and get lots of audiences. So he was always looking through the paper to find strange tales that he could use to make a play. And he read the story of Dr. Flukinger and his misadventures in Transylvania. And he said, "Woo, this is potential. There's some spooky stuff in here I could use." And then, a few weeks later, he read a different article about something else that happened in Transylvania involving this guy, Vlad III. His father was a king of Wallachia, a kingdom that no longer exists in modern-day Romania. And the Wallachian king was called Draco, which means the dragon in Latin. So his son, the prince, became known as the son of the dragon, and in Romanian that's pronounced Draculia. We just say Dracula here. But Draculia was this man's nickname, and he also had another name. They called him Vlad Tepes, which means the Impaler, because he also was at war with the Ottoman Empire. The same empire that in Medvezda was a problem in the 1700s. Well, the Ottoman Empire lasted until World War I, so this was centuries of trouble for the folks in Eastern Europe. And he defended his villages in a very macabre way, you could say. You probably heard about it. He would take the dead bodies of the captured and killed Ottoman soldiers and put them on big, giant stakes like human shish kebabs, lining the gates and the walls of his cities, so that the next wave of invaders would think twice. Can we go somewhere else? I'm not fighting this guy. And he actually loved to spread a rumor through, he just told everybody that I want them to think that I'm going to drink their blood and eat them alive. And created this legend that he was a cannibal for the protection of his own people. So even though we think of Dracula as a villain, in Romania, he's considered a national hero. He accomplished it in the most gross way possible, but he did protect his people. So, and he actually did live in creepy-looking castles like this one, Bran Castle, which you can visit. It's a very popular tourist attraction in Romania today. And I think it was very funny that the Romanian Public Health Department decided to make it a vaccination site. During COVID, I was like, oh, okay, somebody has a good sense of humor, but I don't know about that. Like, come get your shots in our castle. I'm sure you'll come back out again. So here's a woodcut of him. This is all fake because historians now acknowledge that there's no evidence that he actually committed any of these acts. He was just spreading the rumor to scare away invading soldiers. And here he is feasting on organs and blood with, somebody, his chef, preparing his next meal right there, I guess. So these are the things that entered the fertile imagination of Bram Stoker. And this is the reason why I'm telling you the story today, because he converted both of these stories into the novel Dracula. Has anyone ever read it before? It's one of the most popular books of its time in the 1890s when it was published. Anywhere that English was spoken, it was sold. And it was really uniquely written. Well, today we don't do novels like this, but in that time it was called an epistolary novel. It was written not with a narrator, but as if it were a scrapbook. And each page would be an entry from a journal, or a captain's log, or a ship's manifest, or a newspaper article from the London Times. And all of it was constructed so that you felt like you were diving into a real episode of history, The Vampire Loose in the City of London. It's a brilliant book, and I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun reading, and it's not scary compared to what's out there on Netflix today. But it's a great book to read at this time of year, perhaps. And soon after that book came out, we had the era of cinema. And here is the first silent film that featured a vampire, Nosferatu. And that's the German actor Max Schreck, who was accused of biting his co-stars when the cameras were not rolling. Method acting, a little too far, maybe. So when this came out, they didn't have the rights, legally to use the Dracula story. But it was basically the Dracula story, but they changed the name from Count Dracula to Count Orloff. And many of you may have children or grandchildren that grew up reading the books of Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, where the villain is named Count Olaf, and it looks a little bit like that. So there's a little bit of a literary connection to that too. But Nosferatu, a silent film, you know, was terrifying, but honestly, that guy looks like he's been stricken with rabies. I don't know. And only about 9 years later, this is 1922, 9 years later, movies have soundtracks. And so this time they had the rights to use the name Dracula, and in Hollywood they found an actor who was Hungarian, not Transylvanian, but they thought his accent was convincing enough. Bela Lugosi. So he's the one who has famously said things like, "I want to drink your blood." And they had him wearing a fancy, tuxedo and dashing red and black cape. Well, not that you could tell what color it was in a black and white movie. But, so there's the classic vampire movie, and that's why even today kids dress up in tuxedos to be vampires for some reason. It's all based on this Hollywood costume designer's choices. But when I was a teenager, this movie was a popular one, and there, that's Gary Oldman and Keanu Reeves in Francis Ford Coppola's version of Dracula, which actually is much, much closer to the original novel than the 30s Dracula version. But that one, Dracula can be a young man or an old man. That's Gary Oldman. So for another generation of vampire lovers, there were the Twilight stories inspired by the novels of Stephenie Meyer. And just so you know, in case you've read those, she did not try to base her vampires on anything related to Transylvania. She completely created a whole new vampire lore. And in her books, vampires and werewolves are mortal enemies. Which, kind of funny if you think about it from the Transylvania perspective, a werewolf is a baby vampire in Transylvania. But anyway, then your grandkids probably all know vampires from watching the Hotel Transylvania series, where they have the vampire that looks just like Bela Lugosi's character, but in a cartoon, in a completely silly story. So all of that is connected. Here's Vlad the Impaler. So, pop culture, but inspired by true things. So, here is the real vampire, rabies. The rabies virus in this picture are the small sausage-shaped things inside of this, what once was a healthy brain cell. It looks like it's infested. It's a swarm of rabies. And even though people didn't have microscopes, they knew that rabies was dangerous since ancient times. This is a woodcut of a dog with rabies about to get its lights put out. And even now, when an animal gets full-blown rabies, there's nothing we can do for it. And here's a modern-day picture of a sad story of a dog about to get put down with rabies. But just look at that eye. Look at that scary mouth, and look at the foaming drool. I mean, the creature is really confused. It's sad, because it doesn't even know its own masters anymore. And it's just going to be dangerous to anyone who gets near. And that's kind of amazing that such a small thing, this is a modern-day computer-aided design of the rabies virus, what it would look like. You remember what the coronavirus looks like. It's round, but it has those spike proteins on the outside. And just like any other virus, it goes in, changes your genetic code, and uses your own cells' systems to manufacture more copies of itself. And that is actually just like the real vampires, but on the cellular level. And this is an old map, but this is still true. Rabies is everywhere in the world except for New Zealand. And Australia has only bat rabies just like Europe. You see, most of Europe has not a lot of forest and wilderness like we do here in North America. So they have less chances of getting rabies, but bats are still the most common vector. Here, we have a lot of wilderness, and that also means we have a lot more animals that can give us rabies. Yeah, this is connected. I don't know if you heard a story about when Johnny Depp, the actor, was trying to go to Australia to shoot one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. His wife at the time, Amber Heard, had a small dog in a carry-on bag, and they tried to just escape the airport without putting the dog in quarantine. And that almost got them arrested, because they're very strict about that in Australia. Any dogs brought into the country have to be put under 30-day quarantine, because they really don't want to have rabies spread throughout their wildlife. But why do we not worry about rabies anymore? I want to thank somebody I call Louis the Vampire Slayer. Okay, nobody calls him that but me. But do you know who this famous French chemist is? Louis Pasteur. So if you know the work that he did, then you'll understand that his work would have saved Medvedevsky from that tragedy, because he was the inventor of the first ever rabies vaccine, and he also invented the pasteurization process, which would have killed the virus in that milk that that man was selling to his neighbors. So if you probably all know about pasteurization, but it doesn't boil the milk, but they heat it at the bottling plant to just the right temperature. I believe it's about 180 degrees. And that's enough to kill viruses and germs. And then they bottle milk that is sterile and is not going to give you rabies. If only they had that in 1732. So for all those reasons, we don't think about people being able to get rabies. But it's still possible. And, well, I know I'm running low on time, but I do want to just tell you there is a story of a young woman named Gina Giese, who in modern times, only about 15 years ago, she was in church in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and during the Mass, a silver-haired bat started flying around the church. And some of the people in the church grabbed brooms to try to swat the thing out of the sky and kill it, but she told them, "Don't hurt the bat, I'm an animal lover, let me help." And so she tried to save the bat, but she made one mistake. She grabbed it with her bare hands. And without noticing it, she got a tiny cut on her thumb, so small that it didn't draw blood. So remember that rabies only needs to get to your nerves to get into your body. It doesn't need to get into your bloodstream. So with such a small paper cut-like wound, she didn't even think about it twice. She took the little bat to the bushes outside the church and walked back in to hear the rest of the Mass, and probably forgot about that cut until 4 days later she was at her high school playing volleyball. The ball was coming over the net, and she wanted to do a set maneuver, and that's the last thing she remembered seeing was her hands over her head because she blacked out, and all her friends said she fell over like a big domino onto the court. Bam! And they had no idea why. So they called an ambulance, and they sent her to the hospital in Milwaukee, and there the doctors took hours to find out what was wrong because it had been such a long time that they treated someone with rabies that they didn't even think that that was a possibility until several hours later when they realized it's too late for the vaccine to work on her. She's got full-blown rabies. So they thought normally that would be the end of her life and that she'd be doomed. But they tried something they had never tried before in this Milwaukee hospital. They put her into an artificially induced coma, hooked her up to the IV drip and everything, so she wasn't dehydrated. She certainly wasn't running around at night, bothering her neighbors. She was kept in a warm, comfortable environment with the best medical professionals attending to her, and miraculously, she beat the rabies. Her own immune system destroyed the virus because she was kept in the right condition. So they learned about this, and now they call it the Milwaukee Protocol, and it has saved dozens of lives since that time. So now we have not just the vaccine and pasteurization, but we also have a treatment for when it's too late for the other things to work that can save lives. So rabies is no longer fatal. It doesn't have to be if you have the right kind of medical experience around. So thank you, Louis, and thank you, doctors in Milwaukee, for destroying the vampires once and for all, you could say.
We also have the antitoxin that we use too.
Oh, please tell me more. There's an antitoxin for rabies?
I believe so.
Any other doctors?
You're thinking of botulism?
No?
Yeah, because things like botulism are bacteria that make poisons, but rabies doesn't make a poison. It literally just destroys the cells that it infects. So I'm not sure, but I'm not a doctor, even though I might be dressed like one.
Well, okay, I'm not sure about that.
Okay, but yeah, well, we're just to say, let's be glad we live in this time with all these wonders of medical science that have taken so many of these threats away, and that we can just laugh about these stories and not suffer through them. So, now, real quick, because I know we're running out of time, I'm expected to stop in 10 minutes, is that right? Oh boy. So, here is something else, totally different. Let's not talk about vampires, let's talk about zombies now. Has anyone heard of this weird creature, a parasite that is a protist or like a protozoan, like an amoeba or paramecium, but this one is weird. Toxoplasma is a cat parasite. It specializes in living in the intestinal tract of all kinds of cats, including house cats, but lions too. And Toxoplasma can survive in other creatures that are not cats, but it has a very strange way of trying to get itself back to a cat. And a scientist did an experiment with a bunch of mice in a little, habitat in a lab where the mice had their little tunnels and little playthings and wheels. They had all these mice in there, but they gave half of them Toxoplasma intentionally, and the other half were left uninfected. And then they took a piece of paper soaked in cat urine and they dropped it into the middle of the little mouse playground. And the mice without toxoplasma did what you would expect. They all fled to the corners. They tried to hide under the sawdust and run for their lives because they thought a cat was present and they thought they were going to get eaten. But the ones that had toxoplasma ran towards the soaked paper. They were seeking out a cat. And that's not a mouse that's going to live very long if it looks for cats. And scientists have realized that toxoplasma changes something inside the brains of animals that get it that make it more likely to get eaten by a cat. And so the life cycle of the protozoan can only continue if it gets back into a cat. But it happens with mice, rats, and birds because they might be likely to encounter and eat cat poop. Maybe this is why cats always bury their poop. They're trying to be good public health practitioners. But when an animal like a mouse gets that toxoplasma from eating a little cat turd, it might end up doing things that make it more likely to take that disease right back to the cat. So then another group of scientists said, does this have any effect on people? Well, I haven't counted the number of people in this room, but it turns out that 1/3 of the American population has toxoplasma living in their bodies already. Especially if you own cats, it's very likely. Now, it's not fatal, except that this is the reason why pregnant women are told not to have a cat, because it does endanger a developing fetus if you get it while you're pregnant. But if you're already a full-grown adult, it's not thought to have any serious symptoms. Or at least we thought. But then they started doing a study. They did an interesting study at the emergency rooms of several hospitals where they questionnaire the people who were there to see why they were in the hospital. And they sorted out the people who were there for legitimate sickness or like accidents, like true accidents, from the folks who were there for reckless behavior. Like, you know, if you fell off a ladder painting your house, okay, that was a legitimate accident. But if you were driving your motorcycle 150 miles an hour down the highway and then you got in the hospital, they put that down as recklessness. And they noticed that the people who were there for reckless behavior were 10 times more likely to have toxoplasma than the people who were not reckless. Which means that some of the crazier things that people might do might be influenced by this little tiny creature. Think about that. Daring do, daredevils, maybe these heroic acts of people who seem to not fear their own death. Maybe the toxoplasma is in control. Here's the puppet master. So, I thought there's an interesting study. You could take this however you'd like, but Britain also has similar levels of toxoplasma to the United States, about 1/3. But France has double that. 2/3 of the population in France has toxoplasma. Could that explain the can-can? Just saying, there are a lot of historical comparisons between French and English culture, and I wonder how much of it is due to a parasite, and maybe that libertine, frivolous, freewheeling, sans souci lifestyle in France comes from this. Just a speculation. So, well, that sounds like zombies, doesn't it? So I'll quickly wrap it up, and hopefully I'll have a chance for questions. But when people think of zombies, you might think of things like this. 1943, I walked with a zombie. That was the 30s and 40s was the beginning of the zombie becoming a part of American popular culture. And a lot of it is connected to the nation of Haiti in the Caribbean, which was the first, republic made of slaves who overthrew their masters. But the reason why Haiti is associated with zombies is because Haiti is a repository of West African culture for this reason. And zombie is actually a word from West African languages like Dahomey, over in places like Benin and Togo and Nigeria, in that part, in Guinea. That word, in many languages, many countries, is used to describe not a dead person walking, but a kidnapped victim, a slave that's been captured. So how did we get to the idea that a zombie is a dead person alive again? Well, that comes from a very famous story. Here's a real zombie, folks. Not a dead person, but someone in a mental hospital being treated for a very, very sinister form of poisoning. If you want to make a zombie, I hope nobody's taking this too seriously. You folks watch out who's writing this down. And then be careful next time you go to dinner at their house. It starts with a fish like this. One of the many puffer fishes of the world, the spotted porcupine fish in the Caribbean, has a toxin that if ingested at the right dosage will cause complete paralysis. So to the point where your body temperature will drop, your pulse will not be detectable, and you won't be able to bat an eyelash or twitch a muscle, so anybody who looks at you will think that you're dead. You'll even feel cold and clammy. In Japan, they have a sort of adventurous form of dining. They call it fugu, where you go to special sushi and sashimi joints that serve fish like this, and it's like gambling with your health. And occasionally, a diner will knock out cold and be like, oh boy, call the ambulance, and it'll be fine. But if you were using this to kidnap somebody, it would be a brilliant way to do it, right? So in Haiti, there was a practice where people still knew how to make this toxin available, and there was a man named Clervius Narcisse who was sitting with his family in his 20s, a young man, the prime of his life, very healthy, suddenly passed out during dinner, and his family didn't know what to do. They couldn't feel his heart beating, he felt clammy, so luckily for them, they knew that there was a charity hospital, the Albert Schweitzer Hospital, that had just been built by American doctors just down the road in Haiti, and it's kind of like Doctors Without Borders from that time in the 1940s. And they said, let's go see if these American doctors can help. And by bringing him there, they got seen, but they also opened a file. That is what led to us understanding the whole zombie complex. So Clervius Narcisse, at that time, they didn't have all the electronic machines to monitor his heart rate. They just had the old-fashioned stethoscope. They couldn't hear anything. They took his temperature, and it was in the 70s. They were like, I'm sorry, folks, but by every measure we know, he's dead. And so the family tragically came back to the village and prepared a coffin, and they put him in a sarcophagus. In Haiti, just like they do in New Orleans, they don't bury people underground. They bury them above ground in these concrete or stone boxes. And poor Clervius Narcisse was alive and conscious this whole time. He could hear the doctors tell his family he's dead. He could hear the nails being hammered into his coffin. He could hear the stone slab being put over sarcophagus. He literally was buried alive. And before he woke up from the paralysis, the kidnappers who had poisoned him came to get him in the middle of the night. And he heard the stone lid being dragged open. He heard them prying open the coffin with crowbars, and they put him over his shoulder, and they put rocks in the coffin and sailed it back up, just in case anybody ever opened it. They would, or lifted the box, they would still think he was in there. And then he was taken miles and miles away to the other side of Haiti to work as a slave on a sugarcane plantation. And you might think, wait, when he wakes up, won't he just fight back and resist? Well, that comes step 2, the next poison. A plant that some of you have grown in your gardens because it's beautiful flowers. But this plant, Jimson weed, the devil's trumpet, which is a very good name for it, this plant has a very strong toxin that can kill you if you eat the seeds. But if you cut the dose just right, it won't kill you. It just puts you into a permanent state of amnesia. As long as this is in your body, you won't have memory. You will feel like you're in a dreamlike state. You won't remember your own name. And this has happened in modern times. I have a little add-on to this, but this is what was given to Clervius Narcisse and the food that they gave him every morning on this plantation. And he and another group of zombies that were all stuck there, he stayed there for 5 years. But one morning, one of the zombies must have come to. Maybe he didn't eat his bread that was poisoned, or maybe he threw up his food, or the dose was too low. Because one of them came conscious and said, I think we've all been the victim of a horrible crime. And so that night they conspired, the zombies, like, tomorrow morning, don't eat your food. Whatever you do, just don't eat. And then let's make a plan. Let's take our farm tools and hide and ambush these evil people who kidnapped us. And it worked. Their ambush worked. They were able to free themselves. And that means Clervius Narcisse walked back home 5 years after he was buried. Can you imagine that day? The folks would be like, that's Uncle Clervius! Wow! And then, of course, they ran to the cemetery, they opened the sarcophagus and opened the coffin and saw that there was no body in there. Mystery solved. But because that file was created by the doctors at the Albert Schweitzer Hospital, they were able to follow up on that, and that's how the rest of the world kind of learned the recipe for how to make a zombie. So here's Clervius Narcisse, not dead. So if he's alive today, he'd be over 100 years old. I haven't seen any notice of his death, but Haiti is a very chaotic country lately. But he's probably no longer with us, but he must have died of natural causes. He didn't die from being a zombie, but he became sort of famous for this, and there's the sarcophagus where he had been buried falsely behind him. So, So you can become a zombie and live to tell the tale. So, let me know if you have any questions, because I can add more to this, but there is a little funny natural add-on. We might think that humans invented all of these ideas, right? But actually, everything that I talked about happens in nature, and it probably has been happening for millions of years. For example, the jewel wasp. Like the word zombie, the jewel wasp is from West Africa, and its victims are cockroaches. You never thought you'd have sympathy for a cockroach, but you might now. Because if a jewel wasp sees a cockroach, what it does is it goes and bites the cockroach on the back of the head, and the cockroach becomes its own personal zombie. And then it snips the antennae, which is like cutting off the cockroach's connection to the outside world, and then it lays its eggs on the cockroach. And when those eggs hatch, the little wasp larvae move inside, and they have fresh, living cockroach to eat for many days. And I know this is gross, but this is real. So there it is, biting a cockroach. And here it is, dragging its brand new baby stroller. And so the cockroach is not fighting back. It's, yes, master. And then once it finds a suitable place, a place where other predators won't find it because it wants to protect its young, it'll stick it in a crevice in the rocks or somewhere out of sight so a bird won't eat the cockroach. And then inside will hatch the larvae. And yes, there was a scientist who was so amazed by this that he took one of these cockroaches and cut it in half and put a microscope slide in it so that we could see the larvae living inside the cockroach. And before you mock this thing or condemn it, the reason why scientists were studying this is because those little secretions that it's leaving actually kill almost all bacteria known to science, because it's trying to keep its environment clean. And one day our infections might be prevented by the secretions of this horrible little wasp. So you might be grateful to this thing one day. You know, there's things like MRSA and other infections that are hard to beat. Antibiotics can't beat them. This thing might be able to do that. And that's what scientists are testing them for. So we may benefit from even this horrible little zombie maker. And once the cockroach dies, the larvae are practically done developing, and they emerge from the dead husk of the cockroach as fully formed adults, just like mom. And if this sounds like another sci-fi movie you might have seen with starring Sigourney Weaver, you know what I'm talking about? That is exactly what inspired the alien from the Alien movie series. When that astronaut who got an egg laid in his throat, a few days later is sitting at dinner in the spaceship and that horrible thing burst out of his chest, that was completely inspired by this. The artist who designed that was H.R. Geiger, a very strange Swedish artist with a really weird sense of taste. But, so, yes, zombies are real, in a sense. Vampires and werewolves, no. But sort of. But here's a little fish with another parasite I'll leave you with. Have you ever heard of this? The tongue-eating louse? Now, this only happens to fish. Don't worry, it doesn't happen to us. But imagine a little creature crawling into your mouth, eating your tongue, and then serving as a replacement for your tongue. Oh my God. So when you stick out your tongue in the mirror to brush your teeth, your tongue has its own set of eyes and legs. It's not really a louse, although we call it the tongue-eating louse. It's actually a type of parasitic shrimp. And it happens quite often. I've heard that in some species of fish, it's as many as 1 out of 100. So if you're on one of those fishing boats with those big nets, you pull out a few fish, you'll find them in their mouths. And it's the only parasite that replaces what it destroys. Isn't that nice? So, you know, it gets first dibs on everything that goes into your mouth, and it gets to eat everything it wants. And you, if you're a fish, probably never the wiser. So, anyway, I think I'm gonna, if you haven't left, you know, to go to the bathroom to find a little paper bag to throw up in, then I think we're still safe. But I know we're practically out of time, but if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask, I would love to answer them for you.
Please remember to keep the microphone up to your mouth so everyone can hear.
Oh, thank you. I was surprised the voice, I thought it was
And just raise your hand. I'm going to bring the microphone.
Yes.
I missed
how you said the person in the coffin dead made that noise. I missed.
Oh, I guess I didn't say it very specifically, but when they stake vampires through the heart, if your body is still not rotting, your lungs can still hold air, and your vocal cords can still work.
Okay.
So they basically are forcing your voice by compressing your chest. That they're trying to stake your heart, but your lungs are right there. So either it's the hole made by the stake, or your throat, where the sound will come out. And if that happens once every few generations, that's enough to keep the legend going.
Thank you.
And there have been scientists at the famous Body Farm, at a school in the Pacific Northwest, where they do scientific experimentation for CSI investigators to know what happens to bodies that are buried way under a tarp, in a car, and a tree. And then they give that data to detectives to help them solve murders. And they did test that out at the Body Farm, and it does work. You can make a dead body scream. Yes.
What happens if we eat the fish that have the louse?
Well, as far as I know, nothing. No, it doesn't have any. It'll be dead by the cooking. And I don't think any sashimi chef would put that into a sushi roll. I'm sure the restaurant would get shut down if they did. But no, it's not a threat to humans. So, and most likely it'll be dead before you get the fish at the marketplace anyway. I've never seen one on a fish, but usually the people processing the fish will be the ones who find it before you do. But it's not a danger to us, as far as I know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sir, right over that way.
Oh,
Go that way.
the white thing it is. I guess I don't have a question. I just wanted to remark that the process of acquiring a slave by cooking up just the right amount of fish and feeding it to him, and then feeding him for the rest of his life a particular dose of a particular plant, just sounds like a tremendously complicated. I'm impressed that someone figured that out ahead of time.
Yeah, it's a puzzle.
Yeah.
It's an elaborate form of crime, and today it would be impossible to pull off because you would know that person was still alive at any hospital with an EEG or EKG machine. But still, yes, there's some scientists who think it may not be true or maybe less likely, but there is evidence that was used in practice. He probably killed a lot of people by accident. Like, oops, a little bit too much in that. I guess we didn't kidnap them. But yeah, the best way to kidnap somebody is to make somebody think they're dead and nobody goes looking for them. So it comes from that criminal mentality, but it's impressive. Yes, it is. Yes.
I'm interested in what inspired you to find out all this information.
Well, actually, it started with the Scientific American, which is one of our country's oldest scientific magazines. On Halloween, about 12 years ago, had an entry on their website about that story of Johannes Flukinger. And my job at the Fairbanks Museum was to teach kids about nature in many ways. And I just know that kids always remember stuff that grosses them out or makes them laugh. And so I was like, this is going to be a lesson that everybody's going to remember. And I have to say, it's one of my most popular things I've ever taught. And I have kids that I taught years ago come up to me and be like, oh, ever since you told me about that, I love vampires, I love rabies, it really sticks. So it was motivated by that. Kids love to get grossed out. But that also means they're going to remember what I taught them.
And maybe it inspired some of them to become doctors.
I would like to think, yes, I have. I haven't seen that yet, but I do have one student that just got her PhD at Brown University in astronomy, and her mom called me to tell me it was because of my lessons with her about planets in the planetarium. So I take that humbly as like the best possible reward for my job, is to know that somebody took their life and found a great education and a great career because of a story they heard from me. So maybe some doctors will save us one day that got inspired by Nosferatu and werewolves.
And what inspired you to become a science educator?
Well, that's a good question. I've always just loved science and I loved learning, and part of it was I hated when people lied to each other. And I was drawn to science because it was a way to keep people honest. And it was, you make a claim, you have to have evidence. You can't just, pull it out of thin air and trick other people. So sort of like out of an anger of people who are deceptive, I thought of science as a way to get people towards a place where you had to be honest. And you know, and that's what I think started it, and my love of the stars, and my love of, you know, watching science fiction shows like Star Trek, making me want to explore, and my love of hiking and being out in the woods made me want to learn about all the animals and plants. So being curious in general made me want to be a science teacher. And I think it's funny because I've taught this class so many times, but now I serve on the healthcare committee. I don't know if this has anything to do with it. I don't dress like this when I'm in the committee room. So now I work in public policy on things that really do affect people's lives and health. So I feel grateful that I can serve in that capacity, hopefully making our healthcare system a little bit better. It needs help.
And we certainly appreciate that you have made gross things entertaining for us.
By the way, a little segue. In 1732,
George Washington was born.
Oh.
And if you were to look at a current quarter, you'll notice that George looks different. That's because that design was done by a female sculptor who actually won the contest to design the Washington quarter. But the Secretary of the Treasury picked a male engraver over her. So if you want to see the original winner of the contest for the Washington quarter, get a current quarter. They're also known as women quarters because on the back of the coin they do 4 significant women each year.
Yeah. My dad bought me a bag of Maya Angelou quarters when that happened.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby.
Great.